This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. You know the drill. In a world that just doesn't do this, every week I sit down with somebody who doesn't think like me. And I'm excited to speak with my guest today. And I need to give a little history and background, and I'll start at the end of the story. Michael Marshall Smith, supremely successful novelist and screenwriter, is a very good friend of mine. We've never physically met. We became friends 4 or 5 years ago when I turned, when I saw the light and turned on Trump. Michael and I became Twitter friends, and it's expanded beyond that. Michael, welcome. I wanted to sit down with you, and we're recording this Thursday afternoon, because last night, by the way, I should also say this, Michael, and you can describe yourself politically. You guys, everybody knows where I am. I'm a right-wing libertarian. Michael is a good, solid, I would call you a good, genuine, sincere, progressive, left of center dude. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's fair. Yeah, I think of myself as a liberal. I'm not far progressive, more left than centrist, but certainly in that kind of strong liberal grounds.
You're not a flaming lefty, are you?
No, I'm not, and I have respect for some of them because often that's what help drives the conversation in a direction that it's overdue to drive. But I think also we're both of a certain age, and it gets a point where realism cuts in. And you think, okay,
Yeah.
fine, this is a great slogan. We can keep shouting this till the end of time, but it's not actually going to achieve anything. And
Yeah.
the point is not to describe the world; it's to change the world. So let's focus on what we can actually do.
Bingo. And for everybody listening to us right now, the point is, if Michael and I went down the top 20 public policy issues, he and I'd probably disagree on 16 or 17 of them. We differ on most things politically. I love and respect this guy because we've developed a really respectful relationship. Something happened, my friend, in America last night, again, that I know drives you just batty and pisses you off and you feel passionate about. Michael, I got to say one more thing. You've been in America how long?
I spent the first 7 years of my life here, and then we moved here 12, 13 years ago. We're citizens now. As far as I'm concerned, I'm here for good.
You come from the UK.
I come from the UK originally, yeah.
There was a mass shooting in America last night in Maine. As Michael and I come together this afternoon, they still haven't caught the 40-year-old suspect. Latest count is 18 dead, 20 injured. The suspect, Michael, former military guy, skilled marksman and outdoorsman. We'll get into it. Recent history of some medical stuff, some mental issues, but we'll get into all of that. But another mass shooting in America, stunningly horrible numbers, 18 dead. I went to bed last night thinking it was 22 dead. Michael, start here. When you heard about this one again, what was your thought? Where do you go?
Sadness, initially, fury, despair, partly that it happens again, partly that it seems so impossible for people to engage in any kind of rational discussion about it. And I think there's a reason for that, which is that it's simply not a rational subject. People come at it from the point of irrationality. They come at it from the point of feelings rather than thoughts. And the prospect of hearing a bunch of people on the right trot out thoughts and prayers and that the same old bullshit, to be absolutely honest, just drives me to the point of despair. And I speak, it's funny, you talk about numbers, and of course the bigger the numbers get, the more horrific they get, but only as one person's too many. One person's too many. The knock-on effect from one person getting shot in this sort of circumstance is already horrific. It's a matter of quantity, and the real question is how long are we prepared to look ourselves in the face as a culture and as a society where this kind of thing happens a almost daily basis?
I'm a big gun guy. I'm a big Second Amendment guy, but unlike Ted Cruz, I'm honest in that this is a uniquely American problem.
Yeah.
No doubt about, I acknowledge that. We have a shitload of guns. We have plenty of people who have guns who shouldn't have them. Michael, this doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, does it?
No, it doesn't, and I think there are two things that lead to that. The first is the simple matter of the Second Amendment and the way it's been interpreted, because as you're well aware, we've had this discussion. There are different ways of interpreting the not very many words in that death sentence. So it's partly the fact that it's enshrined there in the Constitution to that degree, but it is also, I think, there's a kind of push me pull you between the fact of that amendment and people's attitudes, why the amendment's there in the first place, and what kind of attitudes it enables in
Hey,
people.
my left of center pal, back up for a moment. You said something provocative there, and I love it because you oftentimes say something provocative, and I don't want you holding back. You called the Second Amendment a death sentence.
Yeah,
Explain thyself.
because it is a sentence, and because on the back of it, on the back of the way in which it has been, I believe, misinterpreted, it has led to a situation where people have dug in, and I honestly despair of there being any kind of resolution to this, and partly because I think there has been a covert, subtle, and ominous change in the way that it's discussed. When you and I first encountered each other on Twitter
Yeah,
years ago,
yeah.
I remember some of our first interactions being spats about the
Oh,
Second
yeah,
Amendment.
yeah.
We got past that and started talking about other issues and realized that, though, as you say, on a lot of actual policy, we continue to fight like cats and dogs. There is a kind of, I believe, heart towards what we're trying to do and understand about how we can affect positive change. I think something that I have also noticed in that time is when these things happened 6, 7, 8 years ago, people would leap immediately to, we need guns because that's how we protect ourselves from gun violence. This is how I protect my wife and kids. That was the first recourse. What I've seen a kind of scary shift since the Trump presidency, and particularly since, is that amongst general Second Amendment fans and also the NRA itself, there's been a shift towards focusing more on the, oh, and also we want to be a resistant tyrannical government. And
Ah,
so it's gone from that kind of self protective mode to an existential statement of, we want to be able to take down the government, and what constitutes a tyrannical government will probably be defined by either Trump or Fox News or MTG or Tucker Carlson, and that I think speaks to it being a bigger issue than simply guns per se. There's something in American political culture and American political mindset at the moment which is making this subject even more tangled and even more bloody than it should be.
and the great irony there, Michael, is that so many of my former friends on the right who are afraid of a tyrannical government openly embrace their tyrant, their authoritarian Donald Trump.
Yeah,
The rise of authoritarianism on the right. You and I could engage in about a 6 hour conversation about the Second Amendment, the history of it, the
mm,
rationale for it, and all the rest. It's and you and I would disagree primarily on what it was there for and the reason behind it and how it's been used in the courts and all of that. But do you agree with me, my friend, that it ain't going away? Like that amendment's not going away in America.
I think that is the sad truth of it. I think, the pure politics of what it would take to get that changed.
Yeah.
As I said when we started talking, we could, people can rant until the end of times of what they want to happen in the world. It's more a question of what can we realistically hope to do in the world. And no, I think you'd be on a hiding to nothing to actually get rid of the Second Amendment, but you might be able to affect the ways in which people are drawn to weaponize it.
You lived in the UK. You are
Hmm.
European as well.
Yeah.
You probably interact with, engage with, speak with people abroad all the time. Do they think we're fucking nuts with our guns?
Yeah, they're baffled. They're baffled to the point of just what the fuck are you even doing? What possible? And this is why, I said a little while back, this is not a rational discussion, because if you look at the rationality of it, if you look at the astonishingness of the argument that the way we solve the gun problem is by having more guns, to most people you say that and they just look at you as if you're insane, because it's prima facie a strange argument. It's If you live outside the bubble of the US, and this is a place I love, this is a place I've chosen to make my home,
The
so I'm not.
The U.S.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
not. I'm not being pejorative there.
yeah.
I've raised a kid here who, incidentally, in his junior year at college, was under lockdown because of an active shooter. And you get that phone call. I literally got a phone call from my son who was hiding around a desk, saying, "I'm not supposed to do this, but just so you know, not to panic. It seems to be going okay."
Yeah.
The idea. I have friends in England who have kids of a similar age, and we speak to them after and say, "What's that like?" And I think, "Well, it's fucking terrible. Obviously, how does this happen every day of every week? How can you justify that? How can there be a country that professes to be civilized, that professes to care about its citizens, and yet mandates this happening time and time and time
So,
again?" That makes no sense.
but then, like, answer that for me, because I would, if we were sitting at a bar right now and I'm drinking tequila, I'd slap you upside the head and I'd counter and I'd say,
You could
I
try.
agree with you. It's a problem. This notion of mass shootings in America is a relatively recent phenomena, i.e., the last 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 years, maybe not even that far back. Guns and the gun culture
Mm.
have been with us forever. So why did, is there something else that's changed in our culture?
I think there are several things that have changed. I think one, the pure number of guns has gone up massively. I think if you were to go, I mean, for a start, if you say this is something that's only been around 50 years, well, America as a country has not been here since the dawn of time. So actually, that's a pretty significant percentage of the overall span. So I think one, there is a lot more guns. Two, the way in which the NRA and related organizations have marketed guns and gun ownership has changed a great deal. I think way back in the day, it was somewhat more of a responsible, hey, you like going out and shooting things, or you believe that you need one of these to protect your family, we're here for you. And I think since Lapierre, and particularly in the last 10 years, there has been a substantive and very damaging change in the way that they have positioned gun ownership as a kind of political act more than a kind of social or hobby
So
act.
I will embrace half of what my good friend just said. And I'll start with the good part, the NRA. I mean, they have completely changed the perception of what and why people have guns. Michael, you and I have talked about this. When I was in Congress 10, 11 years ago, I've always owned guns. I couldn't imagine, as a member of Congress, having a Christmas card with myself and members of my family holding guns. And yet we've seen a number of MTG and these others, Lauren
Yeah.
Boebert, like glamorizing this.
Or Congress people wearing those little badges with assault rifles on them into the House. I mean, that's a really good point, Joe, because it is a kind of upfront normalizing of the fetishizing of guns, and that
Glorifying
is
and almost glorifying. Yeah.
and absolutely so, absolutely so.
Now, where I'll push you a little bit is the number of guns. Here's what the data shows us is just generally over the last 40, 50 years, the number of guns in America has skyrocketed. The homicide rate by guns has stayed completely level, but mass shootings have skyrocketed. So the number of guns, I mean, we've got 6 times the number of guns in this country as we did 40 years ago. And the homicide rate by guns is basically the same. But it's this phenomenon of mass shootings have really exploded.
Yeah.
Go answer me this. I know you're also pragmatic and you're practical and you're not going to get rid of the Second Amendment. But if I made you King of America tomorrow, and you do have that in your blood, that king thing. Michael, if you could snap your fingers, what would you do? I mean, if you could get whatever you wanted when it comes, I want to know where you'd start. Guns in this country, what would you do? What's your be all end all?
If I did become king, then I would scrap that amendment because and find some other way of phrasing it. Because I mean, if you have that kind of force majeure, I think that would be one way to clean house. I think there are a number of practical things you could do in terms of very, very stringent background checks, in terms of making sure that there was a limit to how many guns of particular types that any individual could own. Because I think if you've got a guy, I mean, one of the reasons why the number of guns has gone up is because people are owning more and
More
more of
than
guns
one.
as
Yeah.
individuals. And you've got to ask why. What is that about? If you want one gun, theoretically protect your family, that's fine. If someone breaks into your house, you don't need 7 assault rifles and 57 pistols because you're not going to be able to use them. So what is the thinking? That to me seems inherently not to do with any potentially reasonable use of guns, but speaks to a kind of mindset around gun ownership. I would also address exactly the kind of things that you're talking about in terms of glorifying and normalizing guns as an accessory and a prop or a political statement, because as soon as guns get involved in political statements, then people lose their minds and stop being able to talk to each other. And I think a final piece, which is speaks to what your question earlier, is a serious nationwide look at mental health. Now, the first thing that a lot of gun fans and Republicans in general leap to when an event like this happens, and you referenced it earlier with the current crisis in the shooter, is looking at the mental health piece. Now, often that's done sadly as a kind of, well, guns don't kill people, wackos do. Um, it is a fact about the world in general at the moment, but I think particularly about the United States, that there is a genuine mental health crisis. There is a
Yeah.
particularly, perhaps acute mental health
Yeah.
crisis in its manifestation amongst young white men. And one of the things that is kind of, I mean, this is maybe a weird perspective, but imagine you're a young white man who's going through a horrendous mental health crisis for whatever reason. Now, without the guns, what you do is you end up thumping a coworker or you commit suicide, which is a horrendous act in its own right. But with the guns, a particular moment in your life, a particular night, a particular week, can lead to the kind of thing that we're seeing happening today. And that's appalling for the people who get killed and their relatives. It's also appalling for the person who's going through the mental health crisis.
So again, I think this is an area where you and I could find some common ground. Like this main shooter,
Mm.
it in the I mean, even in July, the cops and the military put him in a facility for 3 or 4 weeks for the second time in a year and a half because he was saying crazy things. He was hearing voices, and they were concerned. But then nothing happened.
Mm.
Maine, I think, Michael, doesn't have what's called the red flag law, where a friend or law enforcement could temporarily take guns away from a person if they thought they were endangered. They have what's called a yellow flag law, which is where a doctor would have to prescribe that you are of danger to yourself or others. But it doesn't sound like that was even made available. So here's a guy who owned guns legally. He had clearly had mental issues, and yet nobody seemed to really do anything about it.
I mean, I think it's partly because, the dynamics within families. If you've got a family member who's hurting, your first impulse
Yeah.
is try to support them, not drive them to what could be a further crisis, not label or pigeonhole them with certain types of treatment. And it's hard to tell in those circumstances where's the line? Where do you wander over that someone says, "Oh, okay, actually, this is dangerous," because a lot of the gun violence that happens in this country, including a lot of the, as you say, relatively flat number of homicides that happen, is violence within families. It's men shooting their wives. It's domestic violence is one of the other pieces of this whole gun thing. It's not just mass murders; they're the kind
No.
of headliners, and they're horrendous. But it's the guy who gets pissed and shoots his wife because she's not doing what he wants her to do.
And Michael, and it's the 18-year-old black kid on the south side of Chicago in a gang who, I mean, every day in the city of Chicago or the city of Detroit or the city of St. Louis, there are gang members shooting gang members. And every day and every weekend in my hometown of Chicago, 8, 9, 10, 11 people will be shot
Yeah.
and killed.
Yeah.
And yet we don't even talk about that anymore.
Because it's almost sort of seen. I mean, I think there's two reasons. One, because as soon as you open that box, and the people who want a lot of guns around have very little leg to stand on in terms of just saying, well, no, it's good they have guns because they keep shooting each other. That's not a rational statement. And what you've just highlighted is how it's very it's unavoidable to focus on the current today's manifestation of gun related death, but it happens on so many levels in so many different ways. There is gang warfare, there is domestic violence, there are mass shootings. None of these things are remotely positive, and they all come down to the proliferation and the availability of guns, the lack of background checks, the lack of focus on things like mental health, and the increasing entrenched politicization of the issue to the point where you can't even. It's like what happened with COVID. Suddenly, if you're on the left, you got to wear a mask because otherwise you're siding with the right. And if you're on the right, you've got to say the Second Amendment is the most important thing in the universe. Otherwise, you're being a rhino. It's ridiculous. It prevents there being any kind of useful, substantive conversation.
I when America broke from your ancestors, thank God we did. Um, you and I, by the way, would have gotten along just famously back then.
When about just run off and set up. Trust me, the UK has its own problems at the moment. The world's in a mess all over.
It is. I mean, I firmly believe in how important the Second Amendment is. I believe our founders did. I believe our
Okay, Joe,
ancestors. Go ahead.
let me ask you a question.
Fire.
Explain to
No
me
pun intended.
why you believe the Second Amendment is important.
I believe, Michael Smith, that, and I believe there's substantial backing in some of the founding documents and some of the early writings. We began this great experiment, our founders did, with great healthy skepticism of government and government power, which is why we established what we did. And I think that the Second Amendment was put in there for some practical political reasons, but the primary philosophical reason was ultimately as the final protection against a tyrannical government. Now, Michael, back in that day, the government and us had the same weapon, right? We had the same musket.
Yeah.
But based on a lot of what I've read, and it was we we're free to worship whatever God we want to worship or not. We're free to say whatever we want or not. We're free to our privacy or whatever. And ultimately, we can arm ourselves if and when a government comes to try to take any of these rights away from us. I believe in a nutshell, that's what it was.
And honestly, I largely agree with that. I mean, I would put a nuance in terms of the fact that I think at least a piece of that was a kind of sop to anti-federalists saying, okay, I know you're a bit worried about this whole big United States thing,
Completely.
but just in case you can keep your guns, if you think it's getting out of control, then you can fight back.
And by
So
the
I
way,
think,
Michael,
yes.
by the way, I would have been a major anti-federalist back then.
But here we are in this so-called United States,
Yeah.
and as you highlighted when you were explaining that, it's not like we've all got the same musket now that takes however long to reload. If it all goes P, then us versus the government is going to be a really short fight, and then there'll be a really big crater. So in what way does that 250-year-old stipulation that was, as I think we agree, basically a little bit of a fix and a fudge at the time to get people to go along with the idea of a federal government at that point, why is that still worth defending when thousands and thousands of innocent people are dying every year on the back of it?
Well, I mean, look at me. Here I am 240 some years later, and in my head, in my heart, that's you're a good friend. So I'm going to be straight. That's always part of why I believe still today in the Second Amendment. I mean, I believe in self-defense. It's a freedom issue and all the rest. But even now, and I'm not some crazy loony on the right, but I still today have an innate worry or fear
Mm.
about a tyrannical government that would come to take away any of my freedoms or rights. That's part of what I still feel. Do you feel any of that? Like, is that even a thought or a concern?
No, it's not at all. I mean, partly because of the practicalities of it, which is I assume that a tyrannical government would have recourse to far greater weaponry than I would,
Oh,
even if
completely.
I.
Agreed. Yeah.
So I think on a practical level that doesn't work. I also, on a second practical level, what I'm seeing, if there is any danger that any government would become tyrannical in that sense, I think it would be foolish to regard that to come from the left, given what we're seeing in political
Agreed.
circles in this country at the moment. In which case, there's this weird paradox, which is saying the political side that wants all the guns to protect itself from the side that doesn't have all the guns. That
I,
that to me is
Michael,
tangled.
there's great dishonesty and hypocrisy because most of my former brothers on the right will, in a much more extreme fashion, just say what I said, and yet
Right.
they embrace authoritarianism now, just out
Oh yeah.
cold.
Yeah.
Screw them and screw that. What I find, here's what I find. I want you to respond to this. So there's that shooter in Maine last night,
Yeah.
and Maine is a rural country, a rural state. Huge gun ownership in the state of Maine, obviously, because it's rural. And the minute this guy did what he did and the alerts went out and it was dark and nighttime, people, average citizens in that area, grabbed their guns because a lockdown, stay at home, whatever, don't go out. And citizens around there grabbed their guns generally and waited or were prepared if this guy came into the yard to defend themselves or not. Michael, that's always to me kind of the yin yang of this issue. It's horrible that that guy had a gun and did what he did, but thank God the others in that community, alone in the dark in the woods, had something to protect themselves. You know what I mean?
I do. I do. And trust me, I can understand that kind of that impulse that if a particular type of danger is coming at you, you want to be able to meet it with an equal force. That is also something that I think is baked into, the American cultural psyche,
Yeah.
probably particularly the male
And you
cultural
think
psyche.
too much. You think to too
I, I,
great of a
I think
degree.
massively so because I think if there were statistics available to show that vast numbers of gun homicides had been avoided through gun ownership, then the NRA would be stuffing those down our throat on a second by second basis. I don't think those statistics exist. I think it is a feeling, in the same way that people want the feeling that they would be in a position, however ludicrously, to fight back against the tyrannical government. I think they want the feeling
That's
that they,
fair.
as a father or mother, would be able to protect their own. They want that Papa Bear, Mama Bear feeling that they won't be taken without a fight. And I get it. I get it. But the fact is, you probably will, because the person with the assault rifle is geared up, is in a mental place, is willing to kill. Are you? I don't. I think it's reassuring, but I don't think it's actually going to work in real life. And I don't see much evidence that it often works in real life.
There's data out there, not extensive. I'll grant you that. And much of what you said, Michael, is true. It is more of a feeling, and in reality, the vast majority of us gun owners will never experience that. But then I always and I'll pose this to you. There were parents and kids bowling in that bowling alley last night when this guy came in. You're there with your child bowling. Would you prefer that you, Michael Marshall Smith, were not armed, or that when this guy entered that bowling alley, you would prefer to be trained in a gun and be armed? If you were faced with that situation, like if I were, even though I don't know what's going to happen, that guy walks into the bowling alley, I'd much rather be trained and armed with a gun than to not be. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'll answer the question honestly, but then show that there's a second question behind it. As you frame that situation, then I think everybody would say, sure, yeah. In that
Why not?
situation,
Why not?
I would want
Yeah.
a gun. I would want to be trained how to use it, including the mental capacity to use it, because I'm in that situation. But I don't want to be in that situation. And I think it is a mistake, and it's a slightly disingenuous step to say, to assume that that situation is inevitable. That's like saying, say you're on the edge of a cliff and someone's going to push you off it. Would you like there to be a cushion at the bottom? It's like, well, why am I
This
standing on the cliff?
this is why I love you.
Cliff.
This is why I love you, because you infuriate me, but I so respect being infuriated. Your and I appreciate your honesty. If you are put in that situation, rather a gun, trained in a gun or not, so that I could protect me and my child. But you said, and I appreciate this, I don't ever want to be put in that situation. To which I would respond, love ya, but fuck it. This is a free society. That situation could happen anywhere. We have a shitload of guns. We have crazy people, bad people. You will never be protected 100% from being in that situation, ever, in a free society.
No, of course not. But I mean, part of that comes down to a value system that establishes what freedoms we decide are privileged, and to say that people are free to have a gun is one thing. People are free, or should be free, also not to be shot, not to have their loved ones shot, not to get a phone call saying that their kid's under lockdown. Those to me seem like more important freedoms, and freedoms that.
But Michael, damn, I wish we were sitting at a bar. How can you, in a free society, how can that be a freedom? How can you ever say people deserve to be free from not being shot? Like, I never want it to happen, but it could. You can't erase.
But the problem is, Joe, you're making assumptions on what is inevitable. In the same way that you ask me, if you're in a bowling alley and this happens, you're in this situation. This situation is inevitable. I question whether or not that situation has to be inevitable.
How could you?
Because,
How could it not be inevitable?
if there were fewer guns, if there were much tighter controls on who got them and how many they were allowed to have, if there was if all the money, if half the money spent on guns was spent on meaningful cultural and mental health initiatives in this country, it would make a vast amount of difference. So the part of the problem with the argument for gun is it makes assumptions about what are inevitable conditions of our society and how would you respond to them. And I think the people who are anti-gun or anti the way that guns are currently in this country are questioning those fundamental assumptions about what we have to expect to put up with, because we are free too. We are free not to own guns, and if we choose not to own guns, that should not be a death sentence for it. So we need to challenge some of these assumptions.
Well, and maybe inevitable isn't the word. You can try to minimize the possibility that somebody would walk into a bowling alley where you and your son are. There are things a society could do to try to minimize that.
Like
I
having
don't
fewer
think.
guns.
Well, I'll get to that. Yeah, well, you big jerk. I'll get to that in a second. But you can't erase it.
No.
Like in a free society where 98% of all gun owners are legal law-abiding gun owners, and every now and then one of them will snap or whatever, we can never erase gun violence, but we can try to minimize it. Yeah? It's always going to be there.
Good. Yes.
Because, Michael, even there will never be, we'll respond to this. I don't think there'll ever be fewer guns in America. I think we have to do a better job of keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. But people are buying guns right now as you and I speak, with how Jewish Americans feel. I mean, the numbers I've seen of Jewish Americans out buying guns now because of what's going on. I don't see how you stop that.
By making it harder for people to buy guns. I mean, it's again, and I respect a lot of what you've just said, but I think there are certain inbuilt assumptions, because you're assuming, for example, that people do. You're absolutely right. As soon as anybody tries to make a kind of anti-gun initiative, then people go out and buy a crap ton more guns. That is their response. But that happens because of the availability of guns. If something in Europe or the UK, for example, Jewish people or Palestinians aren't going out and buying a bunch more guns because they can't.
Because they can't. But, okay, you're right. You're right. You're right. And if I were with you right now, I'd kiss you on your forehead because you're right. But like the toothpaste in America is already 240 some years out of the tube. Like if you banned all guns tomorrow, we still have 500 million guns in this country. Like we're never going to go back to that place where there weren't way too many guns in America. Like you couldn't do that here. I
I think you could make. I think you could make a big difference. I think you could, if, and this is hypothetical pie in the sky stuff, which will never happen here. But I think if there were to be some situation in which, because part of this is an existential question for America. What kind of country do we want to be? How afraid do we want to be in a mall or a bowling alley or a high school or a church or a cinema? How geared up do we have to? Do we really want to be a country that professes to be one of the most civilized in the world and yet is talking seriously about training kindergarten teachers to use guns so that their little kids don't get shot in front of them? Do we really want to be that country? That's part of the choice here. That's part of the freedom that we should extend ourselves. We should stop assuming that it's all done and it's just a matter of choosing how to defend yourself against the horror. It may also be because I think if you said, to go back to your question, if you said, okay, no more gun sales, and also let's have an amnesty, really bring it back, we'll pay you for them, it wouldn't in any sense get all the guns back. But there would be some people who might make the decision, you know what, the country could be turning a corner here. Maybe I don't need all of these. Maybe let's reduce the volume. There will be people who strongly believe, as you and other people do, that they have the right to have guns. And there will be people who are nutcases and they will keep their guns. But I think that out of the numbers in general will go down because part of the cloud of gun ownership is this fear, which is generated by the assumption that nothing can change, that America's always going to be like this. And you've just got to be ready to fight back, however ludicrous the idea may be.
Do you acknowledge, my friend, that gun owners like me and so many others, and I'll acknowledge that the aspect of fear that you raised is real. But do you acknowledge that there are other reasons why people would want to be a gun owner besides fear?
I do. I mean, I know you, and we've had many kind of really,
Yeah.
interesting conversations about this. I know a couple of lefty gun owners.
Yeah.
And again, sometimes it's to do with a kind of expression of personal freedom because that kind of desire for personal freedom also exists quite strongly on the left as well as on the right. It's just framed slightly different. And you know what? I get it. They're fun. Firing guns is fun. I've done it. There's a fun element. There is a this is cool element. There is
A hunting element, a
there's a
sportsman
hunting
element. Yeah.
element. There is I know that there are genuinely the people out there who, their special time with their dad was that kind of thing out in the woods and stuff. I get it that not everybody who owns a gun because they're either paranoid, afraid, or an incipient domestic terrorist. I know that you cannot paint every gun owner with that brush. I know that even within the realms of gun owners who have them for reasons that I think are questionable, there are responsible grown-up
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah.
No one's saying that every gun owner is a nut.
Oh God,
It's
no, I
just that
hope not. No.
every gun can cause death, and it has been designed expressly for the purpose. The more of those objects there are in society, particularly given the turmoil that society is going through at the moment, both on a societal level and on an individual mental health level, the more guns that are out there, the more people will die of gun violence.
If you were
It's
starting
simple.
this great experiment in democracy over from scratch, this country over, would you have outlawed gun ownership from the beginning? If you were starting from scratch, Michael, what would you have done when it comes to
At
guns?
that time, I think it would have been impossible to outlaw gun ownership from scratch because of the uncertainty and insecurity that we've
Yeah.
discussed, and also because that was the cultural milieu at the time. I don't think it would have been possible. I would have sent them back into a room for another couple of weeks and said, "This one sentence, dudes, not enough, not enough clarity here. Let's give it another careful go," and not let them go to the pub until they got something that actually made sense, was watertight, and allowed for change. And that's, to come back to what I was saying earlier, I want to allow for the possibility of change. I want to imagine an American future where people don't accept that these circumstances are inevitable and therefore have to arm themselves against them. I think, and part of that has to be a substantive grown-up conversation about guns that is not political, but is geared towards the welfare of the citizens within this country.
And I'd respond by saying you're right. This notion of inevitability we shouldn't accept. Um, uh, uh, Gun homicide has always been with us, always will be with us. And again, the numbers show generally doesn't matter how many guns there are. What happened last night in Maine and what happens in this country 2-3 times a week, these mass shootings shouldn't happen. We shouldn't believe they're inevitable. And my side has to be willing to put guns on the table as part of the conversation. Your side has to be willing to put some other stuff on the table too. But I just don't see people having that conversation.
No, I mean, one of the things I've always valued about talking with you, Joe, is that, as you say, we disagree a lot about a lot of stuff, but we want to talk about it. And
Yeah.
we don't want to have any kind of sacred cows and say, well, I'm certainly not going to listen to anything you say unless you give me this one thing, because that's not going to work. And I think some sort of grassroots movement, both in terms of guns, but in terms of politically, to say, look, whoa, 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 we cannot go on like this because we're just both running in opposite directions and we're leaving a void in the middle. And if you leave a political void, then very bad and creepy things swarm in to fill it. And I think that's the danger in this country, both politically and also on the specifics of gun.
Have you ever wanted to own a gun?
No,
Never thought about it.
no. I mean, I could imagine that if society fell apart and if we moved to a certain
As
type
it's
of
going,
environment,
yeah.
if what I believe to be the unavoidable rules of engagement changed, then I could understand a situation in which I would make that decision. I don't believe we're here yet, and I think it behoves all of us, because none of us, I'll ask you a question. Say
Huh.
I could wave a magic wand and there were reasons for you not to fear either individual violence or the need to take on a tyrannical government. Would you still want the guns, or is it tied only to those two things?
It's a great question, Michael, that nobody's ever asked me. If those two fears of mine were taken away, would I still own guns? That's a great question. I think self-defense is probably my biggest motivation. So if you took that away from me, I don't know that I would. That's a hell of a question. I need to think about that. And part of it is I've always felt this way, but obviously I've been very public the last 9 or 10 years. And so I have to kind of protect myself. But that's a great question, Michael. I don't know that I would if self-defense wasn't a fear.
Yeah. And that's explicable because it's as parents, as people who are people, we love that kind of drive to say, no, you're not going to hurt this person. That's it's in the heart of every man
I
and
just
woman in the world.
and this is that's why I love talking to you about this. Like, I want to always have a gun in my home, and hopefully it'll never ever happen. But if somebody tries to break into my home and I'm trained on how to use a gun, I want to be able to protect my home. I've never thought otherwise. But you've never thought of the need for that.
I think I regard the probability of it happening as being, and I hope I'm correct on this, sufficiently low
Yeah.
that it's not something that I prioritize. It is not within my kind of habit or lifestyle to think, okay, I'll get a gun and I'll get myself trained, not just on how to fire it, but
Right.
also on how to cope with that individual situation, how not to panic, how not
Right.
to accidentally shoot my cat in the head, which is equally likely. Um, there's enough pieces in there that I'm not sure that I would believe that me buying a gun would be a positive thing in that circumstance. And I'm in no sense, it depends where you live, depends on circumstances where you live, depends on age and any number of things. Although I'm aware of the incidents of violent crime and that kind of stuff, it's not sufficiently present in my mind the
Yeah.
whole time that it
Yeah.
directs my behavior, or that I'm allowed by extension for those behaviors to put a society or a culture as a whole in danger.
You mentioned, was it last year there was a lockdown at your son's school?
Yeah. Yeah.
What did you like after that, Michael? What did you two talk about? How did you discuss that with him?
We, I mean, because he was 17, took it in his stride. He was terrified in the moment or scared in the moment, but it's almost one of those things that I think if you're actually there in the circumstance, you respond on kind of gut visceral way. It's the people who are outside it that have the kind of horrific leisure to be aware of the real ramifications of what's going on. It's terrifying. It's genuinely terrifying. My wife cried. I cried. We were just, all it took is that, and then suddenly 17 years of love is bang like that, and our lives are never the same again. And I was not very positive about the existence of guns in the immediate aftermath of that, because without that, it wouldn't have happened. And a myth that I simply do not believe in, because I've never seen any evidence to convince me,
I'm
is
going to send you some evidence.
the good guy with the gun.
I'm
Please
going to
do.
send you.
As you know, I'm always open to new evidence, because there's nothing worse than not being.
I'm going to close with this. I want to ask you a question. But I want to lead my question by saying when the shooting happened last night, and I stayed up late, I did think of you because I really care about this issue, and you care equally about this issue, even though we disagree on some solutions and reforms. And I couldn't wait to follow you on Twitter because I knew you would let it rip a little bit. And I appreciate that about you. If Joe Biden calls you and I and says, get your ass to DC, I'm locking you two in a very nice room in the White House for a Sunday afternoon. Joe Walsh, crazy gun guy, Michael Marshall Smith, lefty, doesn't like guns. I need you, Joe Biden says, to come up with some basic reform that you two can agree to. I wonder if we could.
I believe we could. Yeah, and you know what? I do it in a basement. It wouldn't even have to be that nice. I think this is one of the biggest issue of our times, not just because of the issue itself and
You
the
do.
people who die on the back of it, but because it is latched into much bigger issues to do with national identity, to do with masculine identity, to do with mental health, to do with the ongoing politics of this country. And I think it's almost the nexus at which all of these things intervene. And, we're both reasonable men. I think we could come up with something that neither of us would be delighted with, but would actually make some difference.
I think we
You
would.
call, I'll say yes.
Yeah, I think that'd be fun too. And I bet we'd get great food. I guarantee we'd be fed well. I would try to push you, and you'd push me, but I'd try to push you into doing stuff that we can do before anybody buys a gun to make sure a bad guy doesn't get a gun. So when you talk about universal background checks and a lot more of that stuff, I am willing to really listen and sign on. Hey, last question. I supremely believe, and you are a writer, a successful writer for a long time. I think the biggest problem driving mass shootings and all of this shit is an unbelievable change in our culture and like a loneliness out there. I'll give you the final word. Respond to that, Michael.
I think you're right. I think the level of enemy and people of both sexes, all genders, all ages coming up against, and again, because it's this cloud of stuff, which includes things as apparently irrelevant as AI. Where
Yeah.
does this leave us? How do we earn? How do we support our families? What do we mean? What is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? These are all questions which we're either confronted with every day or swimming around in the background. And that kind of slight sort of lostness and placelessness, I think you've really put your finger on something there. And
Do
that's
we
why,
glorify violence too much in this country?
yes,
Like our movies and our TV and all that?
yeah, and have done for a long time. I mean, it's not just America; it's prevalent in other places too. But I think a lot of those kind of big 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a huge amount of testosterone. This is how we're going to sort this sort of thing out, and the way that's drifted into popular culture in the way that you referenced earlier in terms of Congress critters with
Yeah.
their family with guns in front of a Christmas tree, wearing badges, constantly this. It is now, you don't have to be an action hero in a movie to be doing this. You're sitting there in a suit with a It's just
Yeah.
no. We have to de-foreground this kind of stuff and give ourselves a chance to try and reevaluate what life is, who we are, how we're going to deal with it, preferably in a way that's kind and doesn't involve shooting people.
You are a screenwriter as well. Has Hollywood over the years, and it's a free country, but has Hollywood glorified gun violence?
Yes, without question, for a long, long
Okay.
time. I think, personally, I've noticed in some of the early novels that I wrote, there was a lot of gunplay. A lot of people were
Was
running
there?
around with guns. Oh yeah, because it's a shorthand for a certain type of
Yeah.
excitement and visceral response, which, let's face it and be honest, it's part of what's in the head of some gun owners when they hold their gun.
Yeah.
They're accessing that.
Yeah.
I personally have found myself using, the last couple of novels I wrote, there were no guns, and it wasn't some big no. I mustn't glorify this thing. It was part of it. I think I'm getting older and having a kid and seeing them grown up, and just thinking, sure, you can get a cheap thrill out of this, but I'm tired of it, and I think society's tired of it, and I think the cost is too high. Let's try and think about some other things. Let's try and get our excitement and our sense of purpose and identity some other way. And I think that would be part of the discussion that we would have in this basement or luxury suite.
Hey, Michael Marshall Smith is his name, everybody. Please, he is a treat on Twitter. Follow him, EMEMESS. I'm going to say that one more time, at EMEMESS. Michael's got a Substack out there, Michael Marshall Smith at substack.com. Check it out. My friend, thank you.
Joe, such a pleasure to talk to you as always, and let's hope the main situation gets sorted out soon.
Amen.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.